So it's a real pleasure to be here. And Mary, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to a women's forum. I don't get out very much to do this, so this is a real pleasure. And I basically titled the talk based on 3 goddesses, and we'll be talking about what is it to be a goddess in STEM and a goddess in innovation today, because that is a term that I think is a term of empowerment, and it is a term that has been misused by the media a lot. And so we'll take a look at what it means and what it means for feminine innovation. All right, so how do we define a goddess? If you look at basically the goddess lifestyle, it is defined today in the 21st century as a goddess is a woman. So one of us, any one of us, who breaks the mold. She's who she wants to be, and she offers no apologies. And I would say that the last part of that sentence is absolutely key to success and innovation. When you're innovating, you are breaking the mold. You are not following the beaten path. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said, do not follow the beaten path, rather create one and let others follow. And that is a key motto for innovators, as well as no fear. You will fail many times in fact, but if you keep at it, you will at some point succeed. And after that success, things will become a lot smoother and easier, but you have to try. You can't give up. I name my talk after the 3 goddesses. One is very ancient from ancient Egypt, one is Norse and a little bit more recent, and the other one is somewhere in the middle from India. And all of them were goddesses of knowledge, goddesses of technology, goddesses of measurement. So how is it that we've come from thousands of years before the birth of Christ, where women actually ran temples, did mathematics, educated the population, and were seen as a guiding light, and I'm sure there are similar examples in Buddhism and in China, everywhere across the world, to today, where we're still mostly seen as sex symbols. And people like Kim Kardashian with their butt implants can generate a lot more publicity than an innovation in biotech, such as CAR-T, from the professor in Berkeley, where she might actually have found a cure for cancer. So how is that in our society? How is that dichotomy today? Where when we used to come from, women were actually venerated for their ability to observe, innovate, and contribute to society. It's also interesting to look at. I looked up the top 100 women, most famous women. And today, what does it mean to be famous? Well, if you look at that bullet in green, it means you're either royalty, like Princess Catherine, who generates a lot of press, or you're a social worker, like Indira, basically like Mother Teresa, actresses, singers, writers, poets, athletes. All of them enjoy far more fame. And what was very disappointing on that list, which is readily available on the internet and is one of many, it's very similar, you will see that true innovators, Florence Nightingale, who helped change the way that hospitals deal with sterility, who reduced infection rates by 80%, Marie Curie, Nobel Prize-winning scientist, they're in the 40s. They're not even in the top 10. And then you continue to pioneers like Amelia Earhart or Jane Goodall in biology and in engineering and aeronautics, to entrepreneurs, be it in cosmetics even, are basically at the bottom, mid to bottom of the list. So how is this? How is this in society, and what can we do to change it? If we look at statistics in STEM today, the other very disconcerting fact is while we are earning 57%, so now the majority of all bachelor's degrees, and about 50% of all science and engineering degrees, as you start going past that bachelor's degree curve, and you start looking into what happens to women in the corporate world and in startups and innovation, those numbers dwindle. So just keep in mind the 57% and the 50%. And if you look at where women are now concentrated in engineering, it's more on the chemical materials side as well as civil, rather than what is still considered the hard subjects such as aerospace, electrical, computer, and mechanical. And by the way, I'm an electrical engineer. When I was at Waterloo, there were 5 people in my class of 80. When I came to Stanford, there were 3 women out of 300 in the master's and PhD program, and only 2 finished. So that gives you some of the attrition rates that we still need to work on in terms of the higher education. But higher education doesn't necessarily mean or preclude innovation. What's also interesting is if you see how women then progress into the STEM workforce, because a lot of innovators will spend some time at a large corporation before they break out on their own and start a company, you will basically see that women are most likely to be either in the life sciences or the medical field. They will not be in computer science. In fact, Google, since we mentioned that article by Google, has less than 18% of women in technical roles today. So they are a far cry from that 50% of women graduating with STEM degrees. Women are basically less likely to be, for example, a surgeon, a physician, or a dentist, interestingly, in life sciences. So that means a lot of them end up as nurses, a lot of them end up as nursing assistants, cleaning technicians, etc. And they're basically the least likely, in the end, to use their degrees and be employed in engineering or computer math science, which is also interesting, given, again, that 50% of those degrees are going to women. So where are those women going? And that basically means that educating more women in STEM doesn't necessarily directly translate into those women entering the workforce, being productive in the workforce, and then leading down the innovation path. So you can kind of see how I'm breaking this down, the degrees, down to the workforce, and then we'll look at startups, then we'll look at venture capitalists. And what you'll see is basically a massive attrition in the number of women. So why don't women work in STEM? Well, a lot of women drop out for family responsibilities. In fact, that is the highest reason for Asian women dropping out of the workforce, are basically taking care of elderly parents or children. And if you look at men, men stop working in STEM because they're laid off. Very, very big difference. But as we'll see later, that sense of responsibility in women doesn't mean that they can't work part-time, doesn't mean that they can't start companies, and doesn't mean that they don't have incredible strengths. And while I would argue that the Google article was very detrimental, it also pointed out where we are strong. And instead of looking at that kind of article in a negative light, I would look at it as an opportunity to say, okay, we are different. Let us exploit our differences, because our differences are our strengths. And we'll talk about those specifically a little later in the presentation. So now, all right, so we've basically gone from about 50% to 20-30% in the workforce. Now let's take a look at startups. If you look at the total number of startups with a female founder, even though it has grown more than 5 times from the original number in 2009 of 176 to almost 1,000, which is incredibly encouraging, the overall number of startups is up, and what is depressing is that as a relative percentage of the total number of companies being started, for 5 years there has been no growth in the percentage of companies where at least one founder is female. So that, to me, is a warning sign. And why basically do women avoid founding companies? A lot of it has to do with self-confidence and fundraising and a lack of mentors. In terms of the female-funded companies, what was also highly discouraging was they avoid STEM in general. If you look at where they are, they're in e-commerce, which is great because that's internet technology, but if you actually look at the applications, there are things like clothing clearinghouses, high fashion clearinghouses, makeup, safety for neighborhood communities, redesign of houses, houses upgrade. Then the next biggest segment is in healthcare, which are really in biotech, so those I would say are more legitimate STEM. And then there's a significant portion in media and entertainment, all the apps that a lot of the stars and the actresses are doing, a lot of the cosmetics and domestic products that they're doing. So if you actually start looking at the progress, then it's actually less than 5% of companies today are founded by women in STEM. So the numbers actually dwindle. The other issue is if you start looking at funding, you actually start seeing that at each progressive funding level. So if you start with basically the angel investment, which is usually to get the company going, and then there's the early investment, and then there's the late stage investment to grow the company, usually when it reaches $10 million or more, you can basically see from the lighter to the darker color blue that the funding for women-started companies goes down. And this is another major problem. Those companies should be making the same progress and getting the same funding as men. And in fact, if you look at the statistic on average, guess how much more funding a typical male-started startup generates than a female-started startup over its life cycle? Anybody want to hazard a guess? 6 times more. 600% more on average. Pretty staggering. And raising venture capital is getting harder. So while we see in Inc. magazine and Fortune magazine articles, for example, saying that women companies made up, 4.94%, so almost 5% of all VC deals in 2016, if you actually look at the number of VC dollars going into female-started fund-ups, it's hovering around 2%. So if we recall basically 57% degrees, 50% in STEM, 30 to 40% in the workforce, 17% startups, 2% of the VC funding. That means that the overall global support for female-funded innovation is still very, very low. In fact, much, much lower than what I would have expected. Now, why are female founders great? What are some of these key differentiators that should lead to more of our success? Well, for one, yes, we do raise less capital. And I know this from personal experience. I've had VCs on Sand Hill Road tell me, well, little girl, I was 28 at the time, little girl, what makes you think you can be successful and what makes you think that you're tougher? And my answer was, well, you motherfucker. Why don't you give me a chance and find out? I'll take half your funding and I'll make it go further. And that's how I started my first company, by the way. If you look at the statistics of female entrepreneurs, they're actually nothing short of miraculous, given the lack of support that women have. Women actually started 1.5 times as many companies as the national average in the US. That means women are working 50% harder. And today, there are more than 9 million women-founded or women-run companies in the US. Now, some of these are small, some of these are family-run businesses, but the point is women are innovating, women are entrepreneurs. There is nothing that can take that away from us. Interestingly also, geography does matter. If you're going to start a company, the best place to start it, I would have never guessed this, is in Brooklyn, New York. So I don't know about Canada, so these are US statistics. Las Vegas actually has the highest rate of VC backing. Australia is the best place to start a company. They have all kinds of government initiatives and government programs for female-started companies. Now, what I've skipped is the worst place to start a company is in basically the birthplace of the startup, Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley and San Jose, that is by far the worst place for a woman to start a company. And so basically, what I still don't understand, and I will be researching, is why, if you look at performance of women-founded and women-based companies, they actually outperform everybody except for the best blue-chip companies. And overall, women CEOs have outperformed their peers, if you look at women running public companies, roughly 3-to-1 on Standard & Poor's. So why is it that we are still not getting the empowerment that we need? And finally, let's take a look at venture capital. Of the 100 investors, so kind of 100 top investment funds, only 5% employ women, and that is one woman or more, and in many cases it is one woman. If you look at the percentage of women who are partners in venture funds, it's a little higher, it's about 7%, so it's kind of between 5 and 7%. And out of the 38% who have the one female partner, it's interesting that the additional partners are typically women in Asia. So women in China, women in India, leading the VC groups in those countries for local country, which would tell you that, well, they see women as better ambassadors and better negotiators because they put us in countries where, in fact, it is more difficult to operate. And what was also interesting was only 3 out of the top venture firms are female-founded. So you can basically see these are low single-digit statistics. Very, very sobering after you would think 50 years of venture capital. And if you look at then the investment statistics, though, what is interesting is more people are basically, women-funded funds are more than likely to invest in women-run and women-funded companies, and 3 times more likely to invest in women with CEOs. It wasn't until, for me personally, I was never allowed to run my first company. I only ran it when they kind of ran it into the ground. They needed to find another CEO, so then I got to run it for 6 to 9 months, put it back together, and then they brought a Harvard business-educated man to, quote, run it again because, fixing it, well, of course, that didn't matter. It was running it going forward that mattered, and we went through 6 CEOs in 8 years. Most of them I would have never hired myself, but that was Greylock Venture Partners, very traditional, all male, no female partners, and they would tell me how to dress when I would go to their partner meetings. So usually I ended up dressing exactly the way they didn't tell me to dress, and then they'd be like, well, she's a scientist, scientists are kind of weird, they're kind of out there, so, So she doesn't really understand business clothes, and they had no idea that this was actually on purpose, and that I actually had a brain. So where I believe the future lies is in women creating their own network. If men can do it, why can't we? And basically, it boils down to venture funds for women by women. I've also run a venture fund with my husband, and interestingly enough, all of his investments were male-run, male companies in STEM. All of my companies were female-run, female-founded companies. So the only way I think to really solve this problem is for us to find our goddesses. There are women out there who are incredibly successful, and to convince them that basically they need to support that next generation of women. And if you look, that is already happening. In Silicon Valley, there's a consortium called Astia Angels that basically mentor women, support women. They can bring very seed-level startups of a couple people, and they've already had a lot of successes with funding. You basically now have the angel funds, which are focusing on female-led companies and also training. You have venture funds based by women, including even people like Tyra Banks. You have celebrities now starting venture funds. So if you can marry, money with basically female motivation and venture capital, you can actually start having quite a few funds as well as networks. And so these are now starting to become available for women. So back to the goddess theme. What is a modern goddess? Well, I was trying to figure out how to define a modern entrepreneur, innovator, goddess. Well, I would define it, and this is a little bit arbitrary, as a woman who's achieved a net worth of at least 250 million. That means she can start her own fund. And if you look at basically some of these women here that I've listed, you can see kind of their net worth goes all the way from 2.5 billion to 300 million. But the ones who've been successful have been immensely successful. And ironically, Meg Whitman's my neighbor. But so she's had an incredible amount of insight into why women are not making it more in Silicon Valley. And one of her biggest issues is if you look at the percentage of executives in Silicon Valley, only 11% are women. That's even less than the number of women starting companies, which is around 17%. And if you look at software developers from every level, only about 20% of those are women. So why is it that women are getting 50% of the degrees and then only 20% actually make it through into the workforce? And as I mentioned, Google's only at 18%, and that's for all technical employees. That's not just software programmers. So what I was wondering was what made all these women so immensely successful? And there are many common traits that actually make them very, very similar to one another. The one is all of them have strong personalities. And so what I would say is that is probably one of the necessities, either to have a strong personality or to develop a strong personality. And basically to have your opinions, but not actually proselytize them into the media. To basically walk the walk, not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. And all of these women have an incredibly winning attitude. If you listen to them on TED Talks or you listen to them in their corporate presentations on YouTube, you'll see basically they have a winning attitude, an incredibly positive attitude, and virtually no ego. You compare that to Elon Musk, and it's basically a world of difference, or the guy, from Uber. Then basically, if you look at their attitudes, the employees and the customers come first. It's all about customer service, customer satisfaction, nurturing your employees, growing your employee base, and creating teams. And those are the key three characteristics that have made these women incredibly successful. But if you look at the world today, even women like this constantly have various pressures. And the reason I put these pictures up is to get your mind going, not because I want to show off Kim Kardashian's front and back. If you basically look at the progress that's been made in education, it's fantastic, but it's still not percolating into doctoral degrees, and it's still not percolating into STEM. And a lot of it stems from our culture and our media. Every girl, I still ask a lot of my friends' daughters, who are 6 or 7 or 8, and what do you want to be? Oh, I want to be Princess Elsa, or I want to be, Princess Belle, or I want to be a princess. Well, being a princess, when I was 8 and people would ask me that question, I would say I want to be a dictator of a small island. So we need to have more of that kind of can-do attitude, right? The other is that the Barbie factor, and I actually wear this pink suit on purpose. I call it the Barbie suit. My name is also Barbara. People joke about that. But if you actually look at it, a lot of girls, and I see this in my son's class, my son is 8, have convinced themselves that math is hard. Again, I have no idea how they've managed to convince themselves that math is hard. Math isn't hard. Anybody can do math. But we need to get that out of women and our daughters today and convince them, no, math is actually easy and math can be fun. And the next issue is basically the body image issue. Guess how many girls in California before the age of 18 get breast implants today? Almost a third. That is the number one graduation present. It is not a car. It is breast implants. Followed by lip fillers, which is why companies like Allergan are raking hand over fist in profits and growth. So we still have a major, major problem that intelligence is not seen as attractive in women. And this was true back in Samuel L. Johnson's day, where he basically said a woman preaching is like a dog walking on its hind legs. It's not surprising to see it done badly. It's surprising to see it done at all. Today, there are a lot of women ministers. There are a lot of women in the church. There are a lot of women preaching. And yet, 400 or 500 years ago, it was considered something unthinkable. So why is it today in modern society that we are still putting body image above intelligence in the media? And you'll see basically what it did to a couple of the women I would have called goddesses over time. And then there's basically kind of the partitioning, and this is true in the TV shows, and I'm sure you'll know which one I'm talking about, of geeks versus sex symbols. The really bright guy and the really cute girl. Well, why can't it be the really bright girl and the really cute guy? And finally, we're still dealing with the sex industry. And so I think that, in a way, is holding entrepreneurship back because of image. So now let's take a look at two examples of what I would call the fallen angels, or the goddesses who fell from grace in Silicon Valley. The most poignant example is Elizabeth Holmes. She was the CEO and founder of Theranos. As you know, Theranos has been indicted in many lawsuits now. She had an incredible board of directors, one of these, Steve Jobs types. In fact, she emulated Steve Jobs. And unfortunately, she put image more over substance and press over the reality of making the product. Today, her net worth is zero. And she's actually being sued, so her net worth might be negative. The other is Marissa Myers, who a lot of the VCs and executives in Silicon Valley joke today, well, she's made a lot of money, but she's completely unemployable. And that is, again, a horrid, horrid state to be. And if you look at basically pictures of Marissa from Vogue and a picture of Marissa from, Teen Magazine, basically the issue with these women is that, in fact, they fell prey to the media. Their image became more important. They were very ego-driven. They were not team-based. They were very ego-driven personalities. In fact, they took the worst of the Steve Jobs legacy rather than the innovation. And basically, their lack of execution came back to haunt them in very, very public settings. And they're basically now in Silicon Valley being held as the poster children of why women shouldn't run companies. So in fact, these two women have done us more disservice than the 5 or 6 women that I listed who've done an incredible job, who've built an incredible amount of value, who together have actually built over $100 billion of value. And again, that goes back to the media and perception that we're going to be fighting every day. So, one of my favorite movies that came out this year. Raise your hand, who's seen the movie? Oh my gosh, so for those of you who haven't, rent it on Netflix or watch it at home. Gal Gadot portrays an absolutely wonderful, wonderful character in Wonder Woman. Basically, compassion and strength, and finding yourself, basically finding your inner goddess. And I would use this as a symbol for the new goddess model. What makes us unique? Why should we be innovating? Why should we be leading STEM companies? Well, one, we're pretty good at multitasking. We have to do it anyway. We developed those skills early on, even from babysitting. Our listening and observational abilities, I believe, are superior. Again, because we tend to think more and be more quiet, we've learned to listen and we pay attention to detail. If you think about packing your child's lunch, if you miss the sandwich, that's a disaster. If you miss those cookies that they want, that's a disaster. So even at the fundamental daily routine level, we are trained to pay attention to detail, listen to people's needs, synthesize those needs, and multitask to achieve those needs. So those are some incredible strengths that I would say are unique to women. We're also natural entrepreneurs in that women like to please, we like to create nice environments. And that leads to a desire when implemented in business for customer excellence, and that is what builds companies. We're also team players. We are natural team players. Now, Hillary Clinton didn't say in vain, it takes a village. We are a village. We can easily act like a village. So we have team building, And if you look at, for example, the Holocaust survivors or women who survived and volunteered in the various world wars, we have incredible endurance. If you even look at the women, for example, from Kosovo, women demonstrate in general an incredible level of endurance. It's never recognized, but it's there. And I also believe that the patience, humility, and nurturing abilities that women have can make them excellent investors, because these investments will be fact-driven, people-driven, not ego-driven. So, how do we go forward? How do we nurture the future innovator, the future Wonder Woman? Well, we have started the process. We're making a lot of progress in STEM programs, but we have to basically now complement that with both mentors and investors. It will take a village and nothing less in order to not only provide the capital, even though only 1/3 of women today say that that's the problem, but we need to provide the mentors. So the goddesses, semi-goddesses, nymphs, basically everybody down the food chain needs to basically participate and give back. So this is actually about giving back. I also believe very strongly that women-run venture firms who back women-funded companies can create a network that is parallel. It will just take time. It will take effort and it will take time. And as basically there are more women funding other women, there will be more successful women, and it's one of these positive feedback loops where the more women are successful and more women are giving back, there will be more opportunities for women. And I believe we can do that in the next 10 to 20 years. And so really at the end of the day, if you take a look at the Amazons, who were the semi-goddesses from the ancient Greek mythology, they always took care of themselves. They were a close group, they took care of themselves. So basically the bottom line is, we need to roll up our sleeves and we need to take care of ourselves. We can do this. We're a family, we're a village. And I'll conclude with this quote from one of my favorite books, which is the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which basically tells you what happens to a soul after death and how it travels and is judged and is weighed against a feather. And the quote is basically, all things are possible. Who you are is limited by who you think you are. Thank you.